Imagine a world where language is no longer a barrier, a world where you can speak your mind, connect with others, and seize every opportunity life offers. That's the power of fluency. For me, learning to speak English fluently was more than mastering words and grammar. It was a transformation of who I was and who I believed I could be. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a life-changing one. What if I told you that the same transformation is possible for you? You don't need to be a genius, and you don't need to spend years studying endless grammar rules. What you do need is the right mindset, the right strategies, and the belief that fluency is achievable. Let me share my story with you, how I started, the struggles I faced, the steps I took, and how it all led to a confident, fluent version of myself. Along the way, I'll reveal the secrets that helped me, so you can use them to begin your own journey to fluency. Growing up, I always admired people who could speak English fluently. They made it look so effortless, as if the words were an extension of their thoughts, flowing naturally like a song they had always known. Watching them, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and envy. For me, speaking English was the opposite. It felt like climbing a steep, unending mountain while carrying a heavy backpack filled with doubt and insecurity. I had learned some words and phrases from school and TV, but when the time came to actually use them, my mind would freeze as if someone had pressed pause. I'd find myself second-guessing everything. Was my grammar correct? Did I pronounce that word right? Would people laugh at me or think I sounded strange? That fear became a wall I couldn't climb, and more often than not, it stopped me from even trying. One memory is etched deeply in my mind, a moment that still feels raw whenever I think about it. It was during a group discussion in class. We were reading a book, and the teacher asked each student to share their thoughts on the story. As my classmates spoke, I watched with admiration and a growing sense of dread. They spoke so naturally, their words rolling off their tongues like water flowing downstream. Clear, confident, and full of life. I marveled at how easily they expressed their opinions, how they seemed so comfortable navigating the language that felt like a maze to me. But as their turn ended and mine drew closer, my chest tightened. My hands grew clammy, and my heartbeat thudded loudly in my ears. Finally, the teacher looked at me with an encouraging smile and said, "Your turn. What did you think of the book?" My thoughts raced, and for a moment I felt like I had the answer ready. But when I opened my mouth, all that came out was a shaky, hesitant, good. My voice was so quiet it barely reached the other side of the room. I could feel the weight of every eye on me. Curious, patient, or maybe even judging. My teacher, ever kind, nodded and gave me an understanding smile as if to say, "It's okay. You tried." But inside, I was anything but okay. I felt like I had let myself down. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, and frustration bubbled up like a storm in my chest. Why couldn't I express my thoughts? The ideas were there in my head, clear as day, but they seemed to vanish when I tried to speak. Why was something that seemed so simple for others so painfully difficult for me? That day, I sat in class feeling small, as though my inability to speak had somehow made me invisible. I wanted so desperately to be part of the conversation, to show my teacher and my classmates that I had thoughts and opinions worth sharing. But instead, I felt trapped in a shell, with words I couldn't reach locked away. It wasn't that I didn't try. I rehearsed sentences in my head over and over, but when the moment came, they crumbled under the pressure. The contrast between what I wanted to say and what I could say was stark and disheartening, and the gap felt like an unbridgeable canyon. From that point onward, I became quieter in class, hesitating to raise my hand or volunteer an answer. The memory of that moment lingered, a constant reminder of my fear and insecurity. It wasn't just about speaking. It was about being seen, being understood, and being part of something bigger than myself. Yet, each stumble in English felt like a reminder that I didn't belong in those conversations, that the language was an exclusive club I couldn't join. Even now, when I reflect on that time, I can still feel the sting of those moments, the racing heart, the paralyzing fear, and the heavy silence that followed. But it also planted a seed of determination in me. As much as it hurt, I didn't want to stay in that place of fear and frustration forever. I wanted to understand why it was so hard for me and how I could change it. That memory, though painful, became the spark that eventually pushed me to embark on my journey toward fluency. The moment of change. That day, I went home feeling crushed, like the weight of my struggles was too much to bear. But as I sat alone with my thoughts, something unexpected began to stir inside me. A small but steady spark of determination. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that this didn't have to be the end. I realized, in that moment of self-reflection, that if I didn't take action, nothing would ever change. The fear, the hesitation, and the frustration would continue to follow me, holding me back from opportunities and connections I desperately wanted. I didn't want to look back on my life one day and regret not trying. So, I made a promise to myself, a solemn vow that no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, I would learn to speak English fluently. I would do it for the person I knew I could become. The journey that followed was anything but smooth. At first, the idea of becoming fluent felt overwhelming, almost impossible. Where would I even begin? The mountain I needed to climb seemed higher than ever, But this time, I told myself that it didn't matter how steep the path was. What mattered was that I kept moving forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. I started with the basics, revisiting what I already knew and trying to build from there. At first, progress was painfully slow, and there were countless days when it felt like I was stuck in place. There were moments of doubt when I questioned whether I had what it took. Was I too old to learn? Too inexperienced? Too afraid? Some days were harder than others. I remember sitting with a textbook, reading the same sentence over and over again, trying to make sense of it, only to feel like I was getting nowhere. I remember practicing speaking in front of a mirror, stumbling over words that felt foreign in my mouth, and feeling like I'd never sound natural. There were times when I wanted to give up, to tell myself it was okay to settle for where I was and stop fighting a battle that seemed unwinnable. But every time those thoughts crept in, I reminded myself of the promise I had made. I reminded myself of why I started, of that moment in class when I felt small and invisible, of the dreams I had of expressing myself freely and confidently. I held on to that promise like a lifeline, and slowly but surely, those small, seemingly insignificant steps began to add up. I listened to English every day, surrounding myself with the language even when I didn't fully understand it. I practiced speaking out loud, even if it was just a few sentences a day. I celebrated every little victory, whether it was learning a new word, finishing a sentence without stumbling, or finally understanding a line in a song or movie. Over time, I noticed changes, not just in my skills, but in my mindset. The fear that had once paralyzed me started to lose its grip. The self-doubt that whispered, "You can't do this," grew quieter with every bit of progress I made. It wasn't a sudden transformation. There wasn't one magical moment where everything clicked. Instead, it was a gradual process, like climbing that mountain one step at a time. But eventually, those steps turned into strides, and those strides turned into leaps. The language that once felt like a barrier began to feel like a bridge, something that connected me to the world rather than separating me from it. Each day I grew stronger, braver, and more confident, not just in my ability to speak English, but in my ability to overcome challenges. Looking back, I realized that it wasn't just about learning a language. It was about proving to myself that I could face my fears, persevere through setbacks, and achieve something that once felt out of reach. That spark of determination, born out of frustration and defeat, grew into a flame that lit the path forward. And while the journey is ongoing, I now know that I'm capable of far more than I once believed. That promise I made to myself wasn't just about learning English. It was about becoming the person I always knew I could be. The challenges of learning a new language. Learning English, or any new language, isn't just about memorizing vocabulary lists or practicing pronunciation drills. It's about breaking through the psychological barriers that often feel much bigger than the language itself. While the technical aspects of learning, like grammar rules, new words, and sentence structures, are important, they aren't what hold most people back. The real challenge lies in the mental and emotional hurdles that make the process feel intimidating, frustrating, and at times, insurmountable. These barriers can prevent even the most capable learners from reaching their potential if left unaddressed. I faced many of these challenges firsthand, and each one taught me that learning a language is as much about resilience and mindset as it is about words and grammar. Here are some of the biggest obstacles I encountered, along with the strategies I used to overcome them. Fear of making mistakes. This was one of the most paralyzing challenges for me. Every time I thought about speaking English, a voice in my head would ask, "What if you say something wrong?" The fear of making mistakes felt overwhelming, especially in front of others. I imagined people laughing at my mispronunciations or judging me for using the wrong words. This fear made me hesitate, and more often than not, I'd choose to stay silent rather than risk embarrassment. How I tackled it. I realized that mistakes weren't failures. They were opportunities to learn. It wasn't easy to change my mindset, but I started by reminding myself that every fluent speaker had once been a learner, just like me. Instead of seeing mistakes as something to avoid, I began to embrace them as a natural part of the process. If I said something wrong and someone corrected me, I chose to see it as helpful rather than humiliating. Over time, this shift in perspective gave me the courage to speak more often, even if I wasn't perfect. Lack of confidence. Confidence was another major hurdle. I'd often compare myself to others who seemed to speak effortlessly, and every comparison made me feel smaller. I'd think, why can't I speak like them? Will I ever get to that level? This lack of confidence made me doubt my abilities, and it became a cycle. The more I doubted myself, the less I practiced, and the less I practiced, the more I doubted myself. How I tackled it. Building confidence took time, but I started small. I focused on celebrating tiny victories, like learning a new word, completing a sentence without hesitation, or understanding a phrase in a movie. These small wins reminded me that I was making progress, even if it didn't feel like it at times. I also stopped comparing myself to others and instead focused on my own journey. Everyone learns at their own pace, and my progress was valid, no matter how slow it seemed. Overcoming the fear of judgment. The thought of speaking in front of native speakers or even other learners was terrifying. I worried that people would judge my accent, my grammar, or the fact that I wasn't fluent yet. This fear of judgment often held me back from participating in conversations, even when I had something to say. How I tackled it. I came to understand that most people aren't as critical as we imagine. In fact, many native speakers appreciate when someone tries to speak their language, even if it's not perfect. I reminded myself that the goal wasn't to impress anyone, it was to communicate. I also practiced speaking with supportive friends or language partners who encouraged me and helped me feel more comfortable. Gradually, I realized that the fear of judgment was mostly in my own head. Frustration with slow progress. There were times when it felt like I wasn't improving at all. I'd spend weeks studying, practicing, and listening. But when I tried to speak, the words still didn't come out the way I wanted. This sense of stagnation was discouraging, and it made me question whether all my effort was worth it. How I tackled it. I learned to track my progress in tangible ways. I kept a journal where I recorded new words I learned, sentences I practiced, and even small accomplishments, like ordering food in English or completing a conversation. Looking back on these entries showed me that I was improving, even if the progress felt slow. I also reminded myself that learning a language isn't linear. There are plateaus, but they're temporary. Every small effort adds up over time. Immersion. Immersion isn't just about living in an English-speaking country. It's about making the language a natural part of your daily life, no matter where you are. I turned every corner of my environment into an opportunity to engage with English. Movies and TV shows became my classrooms, with subtitles acting as my guide. At first, I'd read along to understand the dialogue, pausing to repeat lines or write down new phrases. Gradually, I challenged myself by turning off the subtitles and focusing on context clues to grasp the meaning. Music became another powerful tool. I'd listen to songs, look up the lyrics, and sing along, even if I stumbled over tricky pronunciations. Each verse taught me new words and how they fit together naturally. YouTube channels were my window into everyday English, especially those focused on topics I loved, like cooking or travel. Hearing people speak casually about things I was passionate about made the language feel approachable and alive. I even changed my phone's language settings to English and followed English-speaking influencers on social media. Immersion wasn't about grand gestures. It was about surrounding myself with the language in ways that felt exciting and manageable. Over time, the unfamiliar rhythms of English started to feel like second nature. Speaking. Every day. Speaking was the scariest part of learning English, but I realized early on that avoiding it wouldn't help me grow. So, I made a commitment to speak English every single day, even if it was just to myself. At first, I practiced in the mirror, pretending to have conversations. I'd greet my reflection, describe my plans for the day, or narrate my thoughts as I got ready in the morning. When I was cooking, I'd describe each step out loud in English. I'm chopping the onions now. Or, next I'll add the spices. These small, seemingly insignificant moments added up, making speaking less intimidating and more natural. To push myself further, I started preparing for real-life scenarios. If I knew I'd need to speak English at work or school, I'd rehearse the conversation in advance. This helped me feel prepared and reduced my anxiety when the moment came. Speaking every day wasn't about being perfect. It was about building the habit and showing myself that I could do it.